Welcome back, Rabbi Dr. Eliezerbrodt, as we continue strong, moving forward. Season 2 of the Seforim and Chaim Kanievsky. We've been focusing on new manuscripts of Rishonim, how different Gedolim have gone about using them throughout the generations. We've spoken about the Chazon Ish. We've spoken about Rishonim and Meltzer and the Ramban. We've spoken about Orzarua, Meiri, a lot of fascinating material. We ended off last time discussing the Chasam Sofer and the Ramban, and we're going to pick up from over here. But before we start, let me just mention that this season has been dedicated in memory of Moshe Chaim ben Yitzchak Dovid. His neshama shall have an aliyah, and if there are requests for other episodes on other topics, please reach out to myself or Rabbi Dr. Eliezerbrodt. Any questions, any comments, requests on material, feel free to reach out as well. Okay, so why don't you pick up from where you left off, maybe just recap a little bit, and we'll forge on.
Okay, so basically, the first 2 episodes of the season we've been dealing with is something that we see very strongly in Chaim Kanievsky in his Derech Emunah, but in all his Seforim, how he's using everything available that he could get his hands on, so to speak, every Rishon, new Rishonim, and Geonim, and he's using them for his work. He's using it in Derech Emunah, he's using it for example, Kiryas Melech, and his other Seforim. And the question is that if Reb Chaim Kanievsky is so looks at himself as the way I built up in season 1, as one of the main Talmidim of the Chazon Ish, and he goes so much with the Chazon Ish, it's interesting that what became known as a famous sheet of the Chazon Ish, which we will discuss at great length in one of the future episodes, is that the Chazon Ish is not into using new Rishonim, such as Rabbeinu Chananel. There's some quotes, and there's many other quotes, and we'll see the story with that. So how is it that Reb Chaim Kanievsky does such a thing? So we showed that one of the Seforim that had a big impact in a lot of different ways, which we've mentioned the previous season and this season also, is the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah was very into using the Seforim Hanitbasim that was just printed, as he constantly writes, Hanitbas Mechadash, from manuscript. We even mentioned him having a manuscript of the Meiri, and in general, the Mishnah Berurah was very proud. He stresses this, how he learned all the Rishonim, and he has a lot of Rishonim, and this is where I said Reb Chaim Kanievsky L'Chayra got it from there. So in the first 2 episodes of this season, we gave different examples. We discussed about the Orzarua, we discussed the Meiri, we discussed Rabbeinu Chananel, we also discussed the Sefer HaYashar of Rabbeinu Tam, that these were all works that were printed somewhere in the 1800s and onwards. And then we concluded last week in the episode we spoke about the Netziv and the Shi'iltos, which brought us to the 1860s, and then we got back to the 1920s when Rabbi Meltzer prints the Ramban. Now Ramban had been printed before, but some of the Masechtas that he printed were never printed before, and we spoke about how Rabbi Meltzer shows that if people would have had the Ramban, it would have changed possibly would have changed their opinions in certain situations. We spoke about a Gra, famous Gra about Rosh Chodesh, and in this topic we quoted the Chasam Sofer. The Chasam Sofer had a sharp remark about the Gra, because basically the Gra wanted to follow in Hilchos Kriyas HaTorah of Rosh Chodesh, which how you do the Seder of laning. So the Chasam Sofer basically said the Gra Kedarkai changes the Masechta Sofer. Okay. Now Rabbi Meltzer refers you that both the Gra and the Chasam Sofer appears to not have had the Ramban. So the question is, what about the Chasam Sofer? Let's discuss for just 2-3 minutes. What's the story? What was the Chasam Sofer's attitude to all this, the new Rishonim being printed in his lifetime? So last week we quoted that the Sefer HaYashar from Rabbeinu Tam for the first time ever comes out with a beautiful Haskama from who? The Chasam Sofer. Okay, so Haskama is one thing, but do we see the Chasam Sofer using it? So interestingly enough, Shlomo Zalman Hevlin quotes a beautiful Tshuvas Chasam Sofer, where he has 3 Tshuvas devoted to Agunus in Even Ezer, Siman Nun Aleph, Nun Beis, Nun Gimel. Now the significance is it's not like Stam Tshuva and learning; this is Aguna Shaila, and in there it plays out is a Shi'iltos Rabbeinu Tam. Not only does it play out a Shi'iltos Rabbeinu Tam, specifically where in Sefer HaYashar. Interestingly enough, this says the Chasam Sofer, now that we are zeicha to have this print, it changes. We see that the people beforehand, Taisus, the Rush, the Mordechai, they had different nuschais. They didn't have it proper. If they would have seen this, Rabbeinu Tam says the Chasam Sofer, it's very likely they would have passed him differently. And they would not have argued. He says, we were zeicha, ani yagati matzasi dasi yade sefer yashar Rabbeinu Tam. But then he does say, mi anoich lismay chalvanasi mi. So he wants someone else to paskin a Tam Chacham Baki by Ra. Now the reason is this is very commonly found in Aguna Shailas. Most Rabbanim did not like to just paskin themselves in Aguna Shaila. Even the Chasam Sofer, who had no problems paskining, this is specifically Aguna Shaila. But what we're seeing over here is he's willing to use and to argue in Rishonim based on using a Sefer Yashar that was just published from someone in Pressburg that he knew well. So this is one Maramakam with the Chasam Sofer. Okay. Now, another Maramakam at the Chasam Sofer was recently, there's a way to get interesting information of all kinds is through auctions, Seforim auctions. Auctions happen, Seforim auctions, manuscripts are auctioned off a few times a year, actually these days many times a year, and sometimes when you browse through these catalogs, you can pick up all types of information. One time, in recent, maybe less than a year ago, I see is that they're auctioning off a Chasam Sofer's Gemara, and on the side, basically the Chiddush was, there was a cryptic printed Haggah of the Chasam Sofer, but based on the manuscript of the Gemara of the Chasam Sofer, which was being sold for a crazy sum of money. I did not have a chance to check up how much it was, but it was sure it was a sum of money. I don't remember how much it was sold for Lamaisa, but bottom line is, it said clearly in this Haggah, a Ksav Yad of the Taisus Rosh Amsachim that he had. Okay, that's great. So we see the Chasam Sofer was using manuscripts even. Not only the Sefer Yashar was published in his lifetime by someone he knew was using, he even had some manuscripts. Looking at my notes, I came across that one of the experts on the Chasam Sofer has a list of some other places of Chasam Sofer about it. So recently I was curious if there's more sources for this. I reached out to one of the world's greatest experts on the Chasam Sofer. That's Binyomin Hamburger from Bnei Brak, from Chomer Reshes Ashkenaz. He's written a lot on the Chasam Sofer and worked for years on the Chasam Sofer. And he sent me a nice list of a few other places where we see clearly that the Chasam Sofer sometimes even had a manuscript or he's using the manuscript. Okay, I would say 10, 12 places. Okay, this is with the Chasam Sofer. So here what we're seeing is the Chasam Sofer, who's legendary for being a Chadash Asim and Atayr, the whatever that even means, but he was using it. He embraces these new materials, uses them. We've quoted other stuff from him in the past 2 episodes relating to this also. So Adkan with the Chasam Sofer, this is Ha'ara number 1 for today.
So for those who really worked through these shiurim and episodes well may recall that when we were learning Maseches Yevamis, we did an episode on the Aruch Lener. And in that episode, there was discussion about the Aruch Lener and his manuscripts. So perhaps remind those who may not remember exactly or recall exactly what you said, and perhaps you have something new to add for this episode.
Yeah, so just to recap from then, and the significance of mentioning here is not to just promote previous materials. It's also more because it really is part of the story. Part of the story that we're trying to see is the Mishnah Brura, who we said was so into doing this, is this a das yachid, or was it common? And more we're starting to see, as the picture is emerging, that it was more and more common than people might have thought. So now, with the Aruch Lener, this is a significant part of the story. The Aruch Lener is 1798 is when he's born. He dies in 1871. He's prolific, as we discussed by Richos in the Shir devoted to him. One of the things that we found, we discussed, is a journal that he was the head of for about 10 years, from the 1840s till the late 1850s, called Shaimetzin and Emunah. It was published in German and in English. And in there, when you start turning through the pages, besides all the halachic tumults that are happening, there's tons of new things being printed there for the first time. Manuscripts of Geonim, manuscripts of the Gemara, and they're being discussed and handled. And this is all under he was the main person behind this. Not only that, we'll be discussing more at length about this, but the Dikduke Seforim, one of the main people behind the project, which was about manuscripts of the Gemara, was Aruch Lener. We've mentioned then that there were also certain Seforim that came out from Geonim, Rishonim, from manuscript they got Aderes from the Aruch Lener. Not only that, his children, his son-in-laws, they were also into this, and they were we mentioned this, but a letter that was printed in Yeshurun where he wrote actually to the Dikduke Seforim about, is there in the libraries, you author of the Dikduke Seforim, Rafal Nassim, Nata Rabinovich, you go to libraries, you're in libraries, are there any manuscripts that are worthwhile to publish? And he writes back to him a list of a few different chiburim that he knows you could get. Some of them I even have. I could send them to you, and it's kedai to put out. So we see here the Aruch Lener asking him if there's something to do. So we see it's common, and it's a list of 7-8 things. Anyway, and we said his Talmud, Rebbe Zriel Hildenheimer, he ends up going all out with this and also publishing a lot about this. Now, but this is all showing that he's interested in it, he's using it. But what does he use this for in his own personal writing? So there's a tshuva that Shlomo Zalman Hevlin quotes, Rav Moshe Bleich in his article on the sugya of the manuscripts. Also, there's a tshuva of the Binyomin where he writes as follows. He has a tshuva. There's a Ravid, which is bringing down a Ravenu Hageonim. And it seems that even it's Paskin and Shulchan Aruch, but it seems everyone's not clear how to understand this Rav Hageonim. And based on a new manuscript of the Chuvas Hageonim that just came out then, says Aruch Lener, it's clear that it was a misunderstanding, and through that he paskins halacha lemaisa in a hilchos nida shaila, like this new manuscript. So it's brought as a proof. Here we see how far it's not just the intellectual conversation in the journal to print it. He's willing to go even halacha lemaisa. And the point is that his journal, but it's not only in his tshuva. The point with the journal is this journal was being read by all Rabbanim across Europe, not only in Germany. From the writers, we could see it was a very popular journal. People were sending in articles as far as from Yerushalayim. So this was a much more common thing than we realize. Okay, that's the second ha'ara for today.
Okay, fascinating. So go back and listen to that shir on the Aruch Lener for a lot more information on the Aruch Lener. You discussed last time very dramatically for your style how the Netziv traveled from his yeshiva in Volozhin all the way to St. Petersburg to track down manuscripts on the Shi'iltos, and then he put out his pirush, redid it, put out his pirush on the Shi'iltos over Hageonim. Maybe get into that a little bit more and discuss why was it so important for the Netziv to be able to track down the Shi'iltos of Hageonim. Was he only concerned about Hageonim? Was he concerned about other Geonim? Was that something that was going on in that time period? They fill us in and open up that sugya for us as you proceed.
Okay, so now what's interesting is like this. I'm not the as you asked, is that last week we made it all dramatic. So what does it see so significant in the shield, in to write a Perish Hamish Sheli ends up devoting years on this work. It's published over a period of 7 years, but it's clear that he worked on it for a long time. What did he see in this work that was so important? So in order to really even see the significance for our greater story also, I would like to just back up for a minute. Up till now, we're discussing about Rishonim, and it's clear already we're starting to see pictures emerging that a lot of Rishonim are coming out from the late 1780s and onwards. Till as we speak, even this week, stuff comes out. So that's Rishonim. What about Geonim? What's the story with Geonim? So interestingly enough, if someone was a rabbi in 1760 and he wanted to go build himself up a library, he's about to build a library in a shul, whatever, his kailul, and he wants to go get Seforim Geonim, you'd be shocked to hear there's nothing. There would be nothing for him to buy. There were some items that were printed, and the list is so small, it's mind-boggling when one hears the list. I'm going to say the list, not in exact order, but it's very brief. There's a chibur called Hilchos Psukos, very important work in the world of Geonim. It's published in 1516, and then it takes centuries till it's published again. It's so rare that even in the 1880s, when someone else who was working on the Geonim, Dr. Hakavi, which we will get to eventually, Dr. Hakavi, he got a copy from his friend, the Dikduke Seforim, who had a rear library to use it, and it was very important for his work in Geonim. The Hilchos, this is taking us to the 1880s. It's not around, but in the 1516, it exists. It was printed. The Halachas Gedolos and the Shi'iltos that printed in 1546, 1548. Now, so you'll say, okay, but we see, who needs them? The Beis Yosef has them. Interestingly enough, the Netziv already points out that the Beis Yosef didn't have it for the most of his work. When he's working on his work, his massive work, which is incorporating dozens of sources, legendary, as he writes in his Akdama, all the Rishonim that he had. He did not have a Shi'iltos for most of his work. He does quote Shi'iltos most of the time. It's through Kli Sheni, through other sources that Rishonim had the Shi'iltos. But as the Beis Yosef himself, he says at one point he does have it. Well, why? Because basically it's printed in the middle of his work, the Beis Yosef. So even the Beis Yosef, who's a key figure in the rest of the story, where many people used Seforim through secondary sources through the Beis Yosef himself didn't have this work. Same thing with the Halachas Gedolos. It seems he got it very late in his work, so he didn't use it through primary sources. The Mekach Memkar and Mishpatei Shvuos, these are works printed in the 1600s, and then it's gone, not on the market until when? 1782. Rav Amram Goin, Seder of Amram Goin, very important for davening and Chaim, and so too Rav Sadia Goin. These are Chiburim quoted by the Tur. Rishonim have it. The Rav Sadia Goin only comes out in 1941. Rav Amram Goin, for the first time it comes out, is 1865, and even then it's not complete. What about Shuvas? Shuvas, there's virtually nothing. There's a Shuva Sefer printed that has some Geonim in 1575, very rare, very unclear what it even has to do with Geonim, and then there's nothing until the 1780s, a Chuvas Harif, which is that has the print out. We call it Geonim, even though he's not a Geon. He's right the first generations after the Geonim. The Rimagash, his Talmud, also come. This is 1791, and then you have 1802 Shari Tshuva of the Geonim, and a little earlier in 1792 Shari Tzedek. So we're talking about a handful of works. Bechlal, if someone wants to learn Geonim. Now, but when you learn Rishonim, you see Geonim are quoted all the time. But if someone wants to see the prime text, you don't have it. Now, part of the story, which we said came out through the Ramban, the significance is when you see the context of something, you could understand it much better. We showed how, just in one simple little example, Rebbe Zal Meltzer shows that if you, the Ramban, the way it's brought down the Ran in 5 lines versus the real Ramban, how it's brought down in the Ramban's own Chibur, where it's 3 pages come out, and all the give and take, it changes everything. It makes you be able to understand everything much better. But the point is that all these works of Geonim, they didn't have it. It's only starting in 1780s. Now we actually have an episode which will be eventually put up, where we deal with a little bit where this came from, how the Shi'iltos, the work in the Shi'iltos in the 1780s, where this came from. Rabbi Shai Berlin / pick his work on the Shi'iltos, what it did. But fast forward to the Netziv, 1860s, and he goes, and as we said, he wants to go get some of the Geonim stuff. Now, what's really out there? A few volumes, as we just mentioned, because only, let's say, 5 or 6 of these things are printed in before he's working on it. Now, just to backtrack, the Vilna Gaon. What about the Vilna Gaon, who the Netziv is very into also? So interestingly enough, randomly I come across this Bir Gra. He's talking about a makar for a Rambam, and he sends you to the makar of the Rambam is none other than the Mekach Memkar. And when's the Mekach Memkar printed? I just mentioned it's printed. The first time it's printed is in 1602, but that's pretty weird. That's pretty rare. Then the edition that it seems that he must have been using was. It seems that he was using this very rare edition, which is a Chiddush Niflet, but it's not one time. A few times in Choshen Mishpat, to use it for the Rambam Bechlal, he had this rare work. So the Gra had at least one work of Geonim early on. Okay, now, but so we see something. There's a little connection, which is clear with the Gra and the works of Geonim, whatever he was able to have. Okay, fine. But now let's just jump ahead. What about Rav Chaim Kanievsky in all this? I just gave a whole list of Seforim. So Rav Chaim Kanievsky, interestingly enough, we've mentioned a little bit in the past, but in his one thing is we have a list of his library. In the list of his library, so he throws out that we're going to discuss some of the items that he has. But basically, in his Seforim, let's say Kiryat Melech, you'll see him using Rav Amram Gaon, Rav Sadia Gaon. He's using the Shi'iltos all to help with the Rambam. He's using it Bechlal as a Rishon and Derech Emunah, as another Makar. He's using the Netziv Zemek Sheila. He uses Chuvas Arif all the time, so much so that he even worked on. He had manuscripts of the Chuvas Arif, which we don't have, from a Yid, Rabbi Dr. Rothstein. Rabbi Dr. Rothstein was a huge expert in the Rif, and he was working on publishing a bunch of Chuvas the Rif. He did print one volume in a pamphlet, but sadly he died. He was a great perfectionist, so we still don't have all his work on it. But Rav Chaim Kanievsky worked on it for him. We know this how through the videos I mentioned in season 1 of Tiger, where and Chaim Kanievsky quotes Chuvas Harif Miksav Yad. So he's quoting Chaim Kanievsky is quoting manuscripts, even not just that he's using stuff printed. He's quoting manuscripts. He told us to this Tiger that he worked on it for Rothstein. He was paid for it. He says. And in Kiryat Melech, a bunch of times he quotes Rambam, Makairis of Rambam through the Chuvas Harif. Okay, great. Now, and we see him Keseder. He knows Chuvas Harif, Chuvas Rimegash, which is also very important in understanding Rambam, because there's also Messiah. He's a Talmud Arif, who we are explaining has to get us back to the Geonim. But okay, Reb Chaim Kanievsky understands the significance. But what is the significance that he sees? Okay, you want to say answering up Rambams, but is there more to the story that the Netziv, that was his main concern, that he's running to go be able to answer a Rambam? So the answer to this question is found in the Netziv. The Netziv asked this question pretty much, and he explains what is going on. I've already mentioned many times that a lot of times, if you want to understand why someone wrote a sefer or insight and behind the sefer, you don't have to read the sefer only. You could sometimes there's introductions. Introductions are a key to understanding what's going on in the mind of the mechaber. A lot of mechabrim, at least in the olden days, they gave you through their introductions insight into what their goal was. Specifically, the Netziv, who, even though he's very famous today as being the Rosh Hashiva of Alazhin for almost 50 years, and he was a tremendous gadol, but we still have not been zeicha to penetrate the greatness of this person. He was a direct link, following in the footsteps of the Vilna Gaon clearly in all his works that he did. And one of them is the Geonim. I already linked just a few moments ago something a little bit with the Gra and actual works of Geonim. There's also a possibility with Shi'iltos and the Bahag, the same type of story. But so what's the Netziv doing? So the Netziv says, I'm fascinated with the Shi'iltos, and he writes 3 Hagdamas that are it's its own chibur. It's called Kadmas HaEmek, where he explains. You get insight in his whole mahalach. He ends up using this material that he comes up with in this Kadmas HaEmek, unbelievable koyach hachidush that he has over here. You see how he's dancing through Kol HaTorah Kula, literally he's dancing through Bavli, Yerushalmi, Midrashim, everything to create Tanakh, to basically create his worldview that he ends up creating. And this he follows through with his writings of Himek Davar, his writings on Sefrei, Bamidbar Dvarim, where he writes an extensive pirish, and etc. etc. Now, so what does it have to do in the Kadmas HaEmek? What does he tell us about the Shi'iltos? So here he basically says, why was this so important for me? So first, in his first Hagdama, which is called Kadmas HaEmek Rishon, eventually was printed even as its own sefer, but it's found easily in the Himek Shel in the beginning. So he basically lists out the greatness. So in general, I have to say as follows, as a preface, the Netziv writes very cryptic. Even though he was an expert in the Hebrew language, he writes like this on purpose. And a lot of times, the more you read it and the more you understand it, you'll be able to understand it more. And I've been learning through this Hagdama for years and years and years. And literally every time I pick it up, I'm able to understand a little bit more what he means, not to the fullest. It happens to be, it was translated into English, but I wasn't able to pull out my copy. It's buried somewhere in this room. But anyway, he talks about this, and the way he talks, I always feel when I say over Netziv, especially in Hagdama of the Kadmas HaEmek, I'm never doing justice to it, because it's so, in a few cryptic words, he really means much more. So I'm saying that as a Hagdama to some of I'm just going to pull out a few brief lines, and it's funny is because this is really what he even holds of writing B'lashon Kitzer, that the Rishonim wrote B'lashon Kitzer, especially the Geonim, and somehow you have to be able to pull it out. But anyway, he says as follows. He says that, for example, he's talking about the greatness of Geonim. So he says, Rabbeinu Tam, in a Sefer Yashar. Now, which Sefer Yashar? Obviously, the Sefer Yashar that we just got finished saying was printed, and also in last episode was just printed, so he's also using it. We see with great respect how he learns up a particular piece in Bahag. That's what he says. But then he says in another place, he's mamish argues on the Bahag like nobody's business, like nothing doing. Similarly, he says, we find the with the Shi'iltos. At one time, Rabbeinu Tam Mamish calls it Reish L'Geonim, But then in the sugya of Davar Shein Miskaven, he argues on it like it's nobody's business. What's going on here? He says, I already showed that the Shi'iltos Aruch, where did the Aruch get it from? The famous Aruch that everyone always talks about in the sugya of Tzik Reisha and everything. He says he got it from the Shi'iltos. But Rabbeinu Tam, what's going on here? At one hand, you show unbelievable respect. You have unbelievable titles for these chiburim, the Bahag, the Shi'iltos, so to speak. But other times not. Then he digresses and he says like this: the Rambam got from the Messiah, from his father, Talmud Rimagash, the Kabbalah of the Geonim, and every girsa found in the Geonim, every milah, every word that was in Shi'iltos and Bahag, and the Rif even, he picked up on. The Yada Remizaisa V'Shtikaisa Hakol B'Kabbalah. He had a Messiah of everything what's going on, and therefore he was able to. He writes that he was oimid on mamish everything, and he had a Messiah from the Geonim. And even though he will be able to pick up from them and learn everything, even from what they didn't say, what they did say, and how they did it. Okay. Now he says like this. He says and then he starts talking about the Rambam in general, he compares it as opposed to other Rishonim, and how everyone, it's known that they spend a lot of time trying to figure out Pshat in the Rambam, but because they didn't have the Bahag and the Shi'iltos, so much so, he says, even the base, which I quoted earlier, even the Beis Yosef didn't have the Shi'iltos, so they're missing a key step in understanding the Rambam. The Rambam is bringing a whole Messiah, preserving from Geonim. Now it's known, the Rambam says a lot of times openly Geonim, but it's more than that. It's mamish a Pesach Gadol in a whole world thing that doesn't exist because we don't have it. He says, of course, the print, they didn't have it, they weren't Zeicha, and they got plenty because there was a lot of other Rishonim. There's Rashi and the whole Taisus and all these Rishonim. They got plenty. No, he's not Chas v'Shalom attacking anyone or saying anything, but there was a certain thing that they're missing because they didn't have it. Now he goes on and he says unbelievable things, how he's miyashiv different things about it. But in short, he says that he was zeicha to spend time working on this chibur. Okay, great, fine. But I'm still not answering why he chose to do this. So he says basically like this. He's talking about himself, and he says is that I spent time learning Mechilta, Tyrus Kehanim, and Seforim, and I saw how deep it is in helping one understand the Gemara. Obviously, also Midrashim, Bechlal, and he spent a crazy amount of time on this. And everyone knows that the lashonos of these chiburim are very, very hard to understand. And he spent years mastering it. So in order to understand this, he also was fascinated with the Bahag, the Rif, and the Shi'iltos, who also wrote Bekitzer. And through his sensitivity that he picked up through learning the Midrashay Halacha, and in Bechlal Medrash also, he was able to be oimid on through the unbelievable, sophisticated kitzer hadlashon of the Shi'iltos, what he felt he's being meramas, and he held this as a schus. He spent years working on this. Now he says, be'etzem, at this time, what's interesting is like this. At this time, he didn't print his Perush on Seforim. And there's even a question why he didn't. But the point is that, and it's only came out much later in its own story. But what happens is that when we're looking back, says the Netziv, that I wasn't even going to print my Perush on Shi'iltos because I'm still have plenty of years to go. It's 1860s and Netziv dies in 1890s. Why should I be publishing this work that's so sophisticated? Basically, what happened is he copied part of it for his son to look over, and he sent it to him, and it seems it almost got lost. So then he got all nervous. It could be this work that he spent years on working on, it's going to get lost. So then they went and published it. But he said, of course, I can make mistakes. He talks all about that. It's his own discussion. Anyway, in the next Hagdama of his called Kadmas Eimek Hasheni, he goes on and on where he discusses that there's different types of chiburim, and there's chiburim that he calls ma'asvim, and there's chiburim that are in depth. When he talks about he talks about that that let's say even the Rif, if he basically, in short, I really hate not giving it proper quoting every single line and every single unbelievable what he pulls out from here. But basically is that he says is that there's so much going on when you have these works. And if you're holding the sugya and you're so medactic in everything, what they do say, what they don't say, it ends up being a Pesach to understand so much more in learning. So the Netziv, who was beyond sensitive to all this, and as I said, he spent years, years and years of learning and learning. And when it's interesting is when he published this book, the Shi'iltos, when he publishes it, he has a skama from who the Radal, and as the famous story goes, they say the story. There's different parts of the story, but in short, his father-in-law, Rosh Hashiv Volozhin, son of Reb Chaim Volozhin, Reb Yitzchak Volozhiner, the way they say it is, he had a son-in-law. He sees him sitting and learning, but he didn't really know, is he something so special? And all different stories of about the Netziv, which I think half of them are baloney. But anyway, the point is, what happens? How does he find out about his greatness of his son-in-law? Is through the Radal. The Radal doesn't give any askamas, but he has a close relationship through letters. They actually, I'm pretty sure I was able to confirm they did meet maybe once or twice. But the Radal says, by the way, send regards to your son-in-law. He's like, huh, son-in-law? What? You have connection to my son-in-law? And then he finds out, whatever. And Lamaisa, when the Hamek Sheila comes out, it rocks the world, because as I said, it's unbelievable, uncharted territories. Here's a man who's a Rosh Hashiva. He's busy, and he's putting out a work on Geonim, being medayik and called tag shebetag, what it says, what it doesn't say. You have to know Aramaic, unbelievable sensitivity. You have to be holding in all the Rishonim, all the Geonim, whatever he had at the time, and he does this. So the significance is that this is these works were written with a meirdik, a kitzer lashon, and if someone is able to penetrate, so Netziv says it could be he's wrong, maybe he's even wrong, but there is a significance, and what even as he throws out, Beis Yosef didn't even have it. Now the question you'll ask, what about halacha l'maisa using this chibur? We will get to Amir Hashem, but he's using this work even ad halacha l'maisa. Okay, but sorry.
So just to recap, you said you were reading the different lines there. You asked what was the significance. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is what you're saying is that Netziv understood that for a shleimus and understanding kala Torah kula, having a shleimus and understanding the Torah, both perhaps for halacha, but maybe even for hashkafa, and for just to have the understanding and the completion of kala Torah kula, you need to have that piece of the Messiah that the Geonim brought to the table that perhaps was missing. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and the point is, if we have a specific sugya and all of a sudden you have a text of a Geon, even though it's very bekitzer, but if you're mamish holding the sugya, all of a sudden if anyone is familiar, you learn a pasuk in Chumash and you see what the Netziv does with the pasuk, and he shows how a drasha comes from it. So he does the similar thing with the Netziv. With the Shi'iltos, he does the same thing with Seforim. It's an unbelievable system that he built up in seeing the sophistication. There was a method how they did it. There's as I say, a method to the madness. So you look at a drasha, and sometimes you're looking in a Gemara. How do they see it? The Netziv built a bunch of rules. Other people also built rules. So the same thing he held, that in the Geonim, in their cryptic lashon, there's so much more, and it helps you understand the sugya so much more. But that's it in a nutshell. But he says it's so obviously so much better, and where he goes with it, pages and pages about it. And as I said, he writes very short. So imagine if he's devoting a bunch of pages where he takes you all over. Anyway, but the point is, there's a major significance for the Geonim. Okay. But to move on with all this, so he does use this for halacha l'maisa. We'll say that in short, but we're not going to go into that right now. So now, what happens? The Netziv does this with Geonim. Is anyone else doing stuff with Geonim at this period of time? So the answer is there's a nice amount, I would say a dozen or so different chuvas, collections of works of Geonim are coming out from all over. For example, the Aruch Lener mentions that he's passing based on something. Okay. We're not going to go into a complete list. If one wants to see a write-up about the significance of these lists a little bit, in Rachmil Brody, one of the world experts on Geonim of today, in his book on the Geonim in Hebrew, so he does discuss the various aspects, the pros and cons of the various works that were coming out. Okay, but basically what's happening is, from the 1860s and onwards, small works come out here and there. But the problem is, which is very simple, is that when a work, how do you know you're learning a sugya and Gemara Bamatzia Dav Dalid? How do you know if there's a piece in the Geonim? You're going to know that there's a tshuva of a Geon that talks about it. So obviously, not so many people are running to use it. Okay, fast forward to a Yid known as Moshe Binyomin Levine. We've quoted him, Bam Levine. He's referred to. We've spoken about him a few times. We've mentioned that a work of his a few times in various episodes on the Masechtas, which is Otzar Geonim. So who is he? What is he? And how does this relate to continuing with our story? So the answer is like this. He's a Yid, born in 1879, dies in 1944. And around 1898, he becomes very close with Rav Kook. And he's close with him until Rav Kook dies. Now, a lot has been written about him recently. There's a nice article from a Jew, Asaf Yedidya, and he also has a book, Bikoret Muvukeret, where he has a whole chapter about him. And he does similarly, there's an excellent book on Rav Kook, talking about Rav Kook until 1900, from Professor Yehuda Mirsky, called Towards the Mystical Experience of Modernity, The Making of Rav Kook, 1865 to 1904, where he also has chapters where he discusses the relationship of Rav Kook and Bam Levine, as he's known. Now, what does Bam Levine do? So basically, Bam Levine starts in 1906 working on the Geonim. Okay. He starts with Aderes of Shuri Geonim. Now, we've also mentioned in one or two episodes the significance for Jewish history and the document of Aderes of Shuri Geonim, which, thanks to ArtScroll now, is an English translation to it. Just today, someone brought over to me a new edition. Rabbi Rabinowitz brought over a new edition that just came out yesterday or today from Rav Kook, Aderes of Shuri Geonim. It's an edition of his that he put out before. But the Kitzer, who was the first person that really did intense work on Aderes of Shuri Geonim, this was Bam Levine. This was his doctorate. Eventually published as a book. The book, when it's published, is dedicated to who? His Yedid Rav Kook. He moves on to start working more and more intensely on Geonim. He's got a close Talmud of the Derech Rishonim. Anyway, and today it's interesting, not so many people know him. However, interestingly enough, on the other hand, Otzar Geonim was just recently reprinted. So someone's buying the set if they bother to reprint it. Now, what does he do? What's so significant for our story? One of the things he does, besides tracking down new materials of Geonim, is he takes the materials that are in all these publications that are being printed and all these new discoveries, and he puts them al pi the seder of the daf and the Masechta. So he's making it much more approachable. So let's say you're learning daf Nedarim, and you want to know if there's a piece in the Geonim daf Beis, and you want to see what the Netziv saw in them, so you can at least pull out, it's a Geonim, most of the volumes, or all the volumes are in Hebrew books. Anyway, bottom line is he makes this all available. He puts out 12 volumes, and it's a mapecha for those that care about these types of things, making it available. Now, after he dies, there was attempts to continue. Someone sent me a letter a while back that Yaakov Nachum Epstein and Simcha Asaf wrote to Shaul Lieberman to maybe help get funding to continue this amazing, worthy project. Okay. Interestingly enough, I'm looking at my computer about Bam Levine and this project. I come across, or Dessler writes a beautiful letter back in the early 1900s about Bam Levine, that he was talking in London, and he went to hear him, and he talks about his project Bichlal very in a very positive light. He even talks about a lecture that he heard from him. Anyway, but the point is that he was as I said, he was very close. He was very under the influence of Rav Kook, very close to Rav Kook. Now, what's the significance about this? But before we get to this, this will also fine-tune back to what I was saying, what the significance of the Geonim Bichlal is, and what Reb Chaim Kanievsky, who's also using Otzar Geonim Keseder in all his writings. He uses it all the time. What are they seeing in here? So, as I quote many, many times, I quote from Seforim Seforim from Shlomo Yosef Zevin. These are 3 volumes of book reviews of Zevin. Zevin devotes, I would say, 70 pages kamat on the Geonim. He reviews 6 volumes of Otzar Geonim. In each one, he pulls out fascinating chidushim, showing how different pieces help. For Lamashal, he says, the Dvar of Ram had a certain shayla. If he would have opened up the Otzar Geonim, he didn't have the Otzar Geonim at the time, whatever, but Dvar of Ram was actually also pro these types of stuff. Anyway, he goes on and on pages talking about the murder significance, helping understand new questions, stuff that the Achronim handled, all types of things, and he gives, and what's significant to Zevin, it's not just talking about that there's such a thing if you use this material. He gives you many examples through these 70 pages. Very kedai to read. Now, of course, going back to the Rambam, we keep on mentioning it. The Rambam, this is a very key, helpful source for the Rambam. So Reb Zevin points out, yeah, of course. It's also very important for Girsais. There's tons of Girsais going to be found through all this. Anyway, as I said, Reb Chaim Kanievsky is using this throughout. Okay, now Rav Kook, continuing with the Geonim and Rav Kook. So Rav Kook also Chuvas Arif comes out at that time. Someone asking for Haskama, and Rav Kook writes Aderes even for it. And we see also Rav Kook showing the significance of the Rif back with the Rambam. Rabbi Sazal Meltzer and his Aderes on the Chuvas Arif is the same type of thing. So these Gedolim, they're chapping that there's a lot. The intensity, a text of a Geon is very, very important. Now, Rav Kook, referring to Rav Kook in a letter, which he basically outlines a whole Mahalach Halimud to a Rabbi Yisrael Parat, he also discusses one of the many things is important to know and use the literatures of the Geonim. Rav Kook, not only, as I said, was the Rebbe, he wrote very beautifully 2 essays about Otzar Geonim, and he had different interesting shi'iltos about Geonim Bichlal. He built up, which is building off of his. What's the whole connection over here? Very simple. Who's he a Talmud of? The Netziv. Very, very kedai to see is that the Netziv, in the 1880s, they wanted to publish they published in a journal called Knesset Yisrael different write-ups of different people. So they asked Rav Kook, they asked the Netziv, write up your life story. So Rav Kook, the Netziv wasn't doing it, but he told his Talmud, Rav Kook, write up my life story, and so he does. It's an incredible essay, and in there he also emphasizes the galus of the Netziv, talking about his chiburim, he talks about his work in manuscript, he talks about the Shi'iltos, how significant Geonim is for him. So it's clear is that the influence of Volozhin, the Netziv, had an impact on this Yid, who we know as Rav Kook, who had an impact on Levine, who was one of the major impacts in the field of Geonim Bichlal ad hayom. But I just conclude with one last shtickle, one last piece that relates to all this, and that is there was another person possibly that also might have influenced Rav Kook to be pro manuscripts and Geonim also, and that is his father-in-law. And then tragically, after his wife dies, he ends up marrying this person's niece. Niece, and that is the Aderes. The Aderes, who is worthy of numerous podcasts, but we will have Rachmanis. There was a Yid Aderes, one of the great Gedolim of Litto, who ends up coming to Yerushalayim, being the Rav in Yerushalayim until he dies in the early 1900s. Anyway, the Aderes, who is known for being prolific and writing Seforim of all types, all genres, and all things. So number one is that in general, the Aderes Lamashal, the Rash Mishan Sam Psachim was printed from manuscript. And they have a chibur that it seems somehow the manuscript of the Rash Mishans made its way to the Aderes, and he wrote a whole chibur on it, and it was published a bunch of years back. Another story that relates to new Rishonim is the Yereim. The Yereim, interestingly enough, the Yereim, most people do not have a Yereim. What's the significance of the Yereim? So if you look in the Haskama, in 1804, a Yereim was published, and it was published as a beautiful haskama from who? Rabbi Ephraim Zal Margolis. Rabbi Ephraim Zal Margolis outlines how chashuv, he's one of the gedolei talmidim of Rabbeinu Tam. So he even says that he's the Taisus Yishanim on Adarim. But anyway, the point is he's one of the Balei Taisus. So halachic chibur of his is going to be very important. The Beis Yosef did not have a Yereim. Okay, so now they published the Yereim gets published a bunch of years after the Beis Yosef finishes work. It could be even after he dies, but pretty much there's a Yereim out there. But it's not published a million times until 1804. Turns out, in the 1890s, someone goes ahead and finds out that there's a massive manuscript of the Yereim, and the work that was published in 1804 and the late 1500s was a kitzer mamish. It's not the real work of the Yereim, and it's much, much more. So what happens, like all the rest of the stories, so 1890s till the early 1900s, this fellow puts out, based on the manuscripts, an intense be'in the kapirish on he puts out the text of the Yereim for the first time, not published, and then be'in the Aruch. Who does he get Aruch from? The Aderes. The Aderes describes he got a hold of a copy of the Yereim, and he wrote Aruch on it, and then tragically, it seems that parts of it were lost in a fire, that he lost most of his Seforim, which he describes in his an incredible autobiography. Bottom line is that he wrote Ha'aris, and he gives this fellow the Ha'aris, and then gives him a beautiful Haskama also, and the significance of the Re'im. Bottom line is this material comes out. So we see just these are two small examples. I can give him many more. That Aderes is into new Rishonim. One more example, tying it to Geonim, is that, and this will conclude, is as follows: that there was a Yid, Dr. Akavi, which we'll discuss more about him soon. But he started publishing in one of the journals, I think it was called Yagdal Torah, different pieces of Geonim that he was discovering. So he wrote, does anyone care about this? This was mostly a journal about Torah. So the Aderes writes, Avada, every piece of information you could tell us from Geonim is kedai to publish and publish. So here we see, this is in the 1880s. So all I'm showing is that the Rav Kook, who some of his greatest heroes and influences was the Aderes, who he kept up with mamish even after his wife dies. He's his nephew now through marriage, because he married Aderes, his daughter, and they keep up. And he even wrote a book about Aderes after Aderes dies. And so to the Netziv, these influences him, and this triggers with the Otzar Geonim. But to conclude for today is that we see here this whole thing of Geonim, it ends up sparking a whole world which a Yidin B'nai Brak that was just nifter was aimed on and used kaseder in all his Seforim. Something that you will, in many yeshivas, even if they do have some of the works of Geonim, if they have a set of Otzar Geonim, and if you go to Beis Medrash and you pull it off the shelf, you'll see the layers of dust on it. They don't really appreciate it. It's very hard to, the truth is, it is very hard to appreciate, even with the new discoveries that they're doing. Some of them are written in Aramaic and all different reasons behind it. But bottom line is, these big, the superstars did appreciate it. The Netziv, the v'chulu, and including Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky, who uses a kaseder throughout his works. But Amir Tzashem, in the next episode, we will continue to get somewhere closer to the end of our journey with this story.
Okay, fascinating. So, as you said, next episode we'll continue to, I guess, we'll continue on the journey to complete the picture of this topic. Correct. And maybe we'll have to start, figure out some kind of contest, if people could start sending in their guesses, who Rabbi Brott's top 5 heroes are. Sometimes they change here and there, but it's something to think about. We've got to figure out like a nice contest for this. Anyway, till next time, thank you very much.